Thanks for tuning in to Until They're Free. Through this podcast, we hope to change hearts and minds, help our community understand the way the criminal legal system harms survivors of domestic violence, and motivate our community to contribute to important change. Tune in, join us in this work, and we will not stop until they're free. On today's episode of Until They're Free, we are thrilled and lucky to have with us Rebecca Epstein, the Executive Director of the Center on Gender Justice and Opportunity at Georgetown Law. Rebecca has a wealth of experience working with criminalized survivors and has developed substantial expertise in this issue and related issues over the course of her career as an attorney, working in nonprofit spaces for the federal government and in her current capacity. She's widely published and has kind of a unique perspective in having worked on this issue both on the ground in direct services and also in her work in academic and scholarly spaces. We know that you will enjoy and learn a lot from our conversation with Rebecca, which we're excited to share with you now. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. We're really glad to have you here and excited to learn more about your work and hear more from your perspective with your expertise. And we're thankful for your time. So thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Rebecca, would you want to start just by kind of introducing yourself and your background and tell us a little bit about your work and how you came to work with criminalized survivors and this podcast?
I'm the executive director of the Center on Gender Justice and Opportunity at Georgetown Law. So we're affiliated with Georgetown Law. We're on the campus of Georgetown Law in Washington, D.C., but really we function a lot more like a nonprofit organization. And our mission is to work toward race and gender equity in public systems, so in courts and hospitals and schools, identifying inequities and identifying solutions through research, law and policy solutions, and through public outreach. And I haven't always been in the academic scene, although I still consider myself only academic adjacent. I came to this from being a litigator. So after I clerked in the Eastern District of Virginia, I spent a year with the Women's Legal Defense Fund, which is now called the National Partnership on Women and Families. And then I joined the Department of Justice in their Civil Rights Division, which was my dream job. And the reason that I went to law school was to pursue a civil rights career with a focus on race and sex discrimination, which is what I did in the Civil Rights Division. So I worked on police misconduct cases where police were engaging in excessive force or racial profiling of people of color, and enforcing the Freedom of Accesses to Clinic Entrances Act, which was passed under President Clinton to protect access into reproductive health care clinics. So that really grounded me in litigation strategy and precedent-setting cases about race and sex discrimination. And when I made this transfer into law and policy, I'm trying to bring my skills as a litigator to this work, which in large part involves being able to tell a story in the 30-second package that a judge might give you, or in a way that a jury can relate to. So our focus is less on law review articles and more on lay people's reports and content that's directed at practitioners and policymakers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Super interesting background. And it sounds like you have a lot of kind of variety of expertise that informs the work that you're doing now in a really important and meaningful way. So do you want to tell us, you talked about this in kind of your introduction of yourself, but a little bit more about the center that you direct and the work that you all do, how y'all came to be, what kind of projects you're focusing on?
When I first came to the center, we had one grant to pursue work on marginalized girls. And I was brought on to sort of implement that grant. And since that time, we've grown exponentially to additional funders and staff. And we are pursuing lots of different issue areas, one of which is the adultification bias against Black girls that we identified in a study that was released in 2017, but also criminalized survivors. And I came to that work when I first came into this job and started working on a report that we were ultimately to call the abuse to prison pipeline. And I was working with very knowledgeable colleagues at Rights for Girls and the Vera Institute and the Ms. Foundation on identifying paths into the juvenile justice system for girls who had experienced gender-based violence. And the work was so important that we wound up releasing an update to that report in 2023. And then I just wanted to take that work another step further by really drilling down on what solutions can be for both girls and women who are criminalized survivors, and to give tools to practitioners and judges on how to break what we call the abuse to prison pipeline.
That's super interesting. Thank you. And super important. I think that coming from the direct practice kind of side of that issue, data tends to be a big gap, I think, in the field that there aren't as many as probably would be ideal academic studies or data collection type projects to give us some really good information about the scope of the issue and how it's actually looking on the ground across the country. So very interested to hear more about what you found in your studies. So in kind of looking specifically at the work you mentioned about criminalized survivors and the abuse to prison pipeline study and other kind of related work that you've done, what are some of the paths that you've identified that survivors of gender-based violence take into the criminal legal system, like the sexual abuse to prison pipeline that you mentioned?
Or so when we talk about this, we often order it in terms of severity of involvement in the justice system. And one of the earliest paths in that we've identified and worked on is false reporting charges. And that happens when people who've experienced sexual assault trust police enough to report it, but they're not believed. And instead of being treated as a victim or a witness, they're charged with giving false information to law enforcement and are prosecuted as a result of that. Another path that we've identified is sex trafficking that's not recognized for what it is and is instead treated as prostitution charges, and also proxy charges to that, like loitering and other offenses that can be charged against people who are actually victims of sex trafficking. And then we also identified coerced criminalization, which is often in effect with trafficking victims, but not restricted to that, where survivors of gender-based violence are forced to commit crimes by their abusers and traffickers. And it's often unrecognized because the coercion is not always done by pointing a gun at the woman or girl, and instead the underlying dynamics of abusive relationships and the threat of sexual violence is what forces them into criminalization. And that's all too often not recognized by law enforcement and in the courts. And then we've also looked at acts of survival by survivors of gender-based violence, where victims of intimate partner violence and other patterns of sexual abuse take action against their abuser or trafficker to escape. And in doing so, they harm their abuser or trafficker. But law enforcement, again, and the courts don't take into account the context of the survivor's actions. And so the system arrests them, prosecutes them in isolation of the harm that was a constant threat over their heads that they took action to survive or escape.
Thanks so much. And yeah, and I know we'll talk a little bit later kind of about some work that you've done and are doing on what you've learned about the legal system's response to these things around the country. But I think that was a really helpful picture of how criminalization of survival looks a number of ways, because it seems to be that what kind of the general sense of that concept out in the world is something that people tend to quickly think about acts of survival or acting in self-defense against the abusive partner, but it can look so many ways. And the breadth of it, I think, makes it challenging for the legal system, especially as it's currently constructed, if we don't make changes that are directly responsive to that understanding. It makes it really, really hard for these folks to um, have any sort of shot really in the criminal legal system at prevailing and not ending up criminalized, which is something we're really hoping to focus on in the legislative work that we're doing, especially with regard to what you talked about with coercion. I'm just curious, have you noted anything or in kind of things that seem common in the legal system, or if there seems to be some sort of good solution that you've come across, which may not be the case yet, hopefully one day, if not yet already. But in response to some of these things like loitering, for example, that's connected to trafficking, something that doesn't quite squarely fit in the box of an act of survival or self-defense, or the legal system has sometimes poorly structured to respond to these kind of cases, but things like coercion and duress. But if it's something that's like tied, but it's harder to show or point to, even if there wasn't a threat, he told her to do it, for example, which again, we know the system doesn't adequately account for those either. But some of these kind of like collateral to trafficking, I believe is the way you described it, how those are working. I mean, my guess would be, and what I've seen is they're just not taking the dynamics into account at all. But I'm curious if that's what you've seen and if you've seen anybody come up with some sort of proposed solution to that problem that you think might be effective.
Well, we can get to solutions, maybe in the context of looking at laws a little bit later. But one important aspect to this problem is the failure to do the work, or maybe to be informed enough to look behind the charges and at the root cause of why the woman or girl is behaving in the way she is, or the survivor of gender-based violence. We focus on girls. Um, but of course, this is a gender neutral problem. And so one of the pathways that affect girls, and not adults, is status offenses. So those are the offenses that are defined by age, that aren't offenses if you're an adult, like truancy, missing school, or missing curfew, or running away from home. And girls are disproportionately arrested for status offenses. But where are they running away from, and why are they running away? Or why are they missing school? Traffickers have been known to forbid girls from attending school. And if there's abuse happening at the home, girls might be running away from that. So to punish that behavior, which in some instances can lead in directly into the juvenile justice system, is the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be treating these girls like survivors of sexual violence and supporting them accordingly. And instead, we're treating them like offenders.
Certainly, it's really helpful. Thank you. And I think, something that we talk about a lot in our work too is that legal system solutions are necessary. And on top of those, in order to implement them effectively, we have to make sure that the folks who are on the ground responding have adequate training and understanding of these dynamics, because we also know that police officers in certain circumstances have a choice as to whether or not they arrest someone, for example, or a prosecutor in many circumstances, most circumstances, has a choice. They have discretion to decide whether or not to pursue charges. We've talked to law enforcement officers who say, I felt like I didn't have a choice based on the evidence, but what I did do to try to help was document as effectively as I could what I thought really was going on and try to be very explicit with the prosecutors that I don't think this person should have charges
Mm-hmm.
actually pursued against them. And we can't wholly rely on training, and that's not always the case, right? That conversation was from some, I think, particularly well trained officers, but it seems like we can't really rely on only training or only legal solutions, and we really need both.
Right.
Do you agree with that? Is that your experience?
100%. And there's a lot more that needs to be done as well, including changing office culture for prosecutors and police officers to reward not for number of closed cases or convictions, but in the ethical and just pursuing of any given case. And that requires some time, that requires some education, but that also requires a reward system and culture that encourages that kind of law enforcement choices that police and prosecutors are making every day. And I think it also requires collaboration with people in the community and getting to know the people who are affected by their criminalization. So meeting with survivors of gender-based violence and gathering input on what they feel would benefit them most can really go a long way to creating some preventative solutions, but also alternatives to incarceration, and especially in terms of girls, where we want to be looking at diversion as much as possible. The supposed purpose of the juvenile justice system is to pursue rehabilitation and not to punish, per se. And that has been turned completely on its head in many cases. And children are often being transferred to adult court or being treated as if they're adults punitively without regard to their stage of neurological development or their stage of maturity, all the pieces of science that even the Supreme Court has relied on in the past to justify treating children differently than adults.
Super helpful context. Thank you. And I think, yeah, I'm really glad you made the point about centering survivor voices because we know survivors are the experts in their own experience and folks we know what the rules say and how the criminal legal system is in theory supposed to work, but we know that it doesn't always work in the way that it's written up and that no one can describe the ins and outs of that better than the people who have lived it. So I'm glad you noted that and also the kind of, conversation around community and culture change is I think an important reminder to all of us and folks listening to this podcast too that you don't have to be a professional who's directly working on these issues like a police officer or a lawyer or a judge to contribute to meaningful change because we know that sociocultural views and bias and all of those things have such a strong and significant impact on the way these things are handled and the outcomes. Um,
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I think it's essential to include of impacted people and also voices of authority in the community in creating effective solutions. You can't get anywhere without that input. And young people, especially, are often marginalized and really not, their voices aren't heard at all, even though the trajectory of their lives are being determined as a result. And one thing that also affects girls in terms of that's sort of a macrocosm of what's happening with women is that when girls are engaging in behavior that violates the norms that white middle class culture has set for girls, they can be looked at as bad girls who are they are less deserving of compassion and leniency than other girls. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, sometimes girls are seen as needing to be saved, especially in the trafficking context. And in the name of protection, they are sometimes incarcerated as a measure of safety, using air quotes for that, because this savior complex kicks in And there is the naive, at best, belief that being incarcerated actually supports survivors of gender-based violence, which couldn't be farther from the truth if you've ever visited a juvenile justice facility for girls.
That's such an insightful and helpful framing of the impact of the savior complex, but especially on girls, it makes sense that, we might perceive children as vulnerable. And again, kind of going to what you talked about earlier about centering survivors' experiences, I would guess that, and from my, I've worked more with adults, but that the lived experience of a girl who ends up in a trafficking situation could look a lot of ways, but likely due to, social and societal inequities that we know might make someone at increased risk to end up in a situation like that. They might have lived a lot of things that a lot of other young girls haven't lived. But regardless, they have expertise about their own situation and what's best for them that no one else does because they're not them. And you mentioned some helpful kind of thoughts on, diversion from the criminal legal system entirely. But what are some other kind of thoughts that come to mind for you about ways we can keep specifically girls in mind as we look at system and legal relief and reform for criminalized survivors?
There's a lot of alternatives to being punished as if the girl is somehow a perpetrator of a crime. Restorative justice practices have been used. Diversion seems like the most important one. Keeping girls in their community is the best way to ensure that they succeed and that they thrive. We've developed a sort of a cycle approach to how we look at the abuse to prison pipeline, which is that if a girl is subjected to sexual abuse, violence, or trafficking and is put into the justice system, where she is not only not treated for the trauma that she has survived, but is subjected possibly to new traumatizing events, whether that's actual sexual assault while she's in the facility or demeaning, triggering procedures in the juvenile justice facility that can include strip searches, et cetera, and the basic dehumanization of being in a facility. So one piece that's important to remember in drafting bills that will reform our response to survivors is to make sure to cross-reference juvenile criminal procedure to make sure that the relief also applies to girls, to enact measures to stop the transfer of juveniles to the adult criminal system, and sometimes enact per se rules determining that all children under 18, or I would argue up to age 25, when the brain maturation process actually finishes, can't be prosecuted for things like sex trafficking. They should be per se victims, as is reflected in federal law.
Thanks so much. Those are really helpful, concrete things for us to think about as we pursue legal relief and hopefully folks listening to this and around the country. So something you mentioned earlier on is the concept of adultification bias. So I'm really interested to learn more about that. So would you tell us a little bit more about that? And it sounds from what you said earlier and the little that I know about it, that it is something that disproportionately affects Black girls specifically. So would you tell us a little bit more about that concept and how it can contribute to the criminalization of Black girls who survive gender-based violence?
Adultification bias is the perception by adults of Black girls as being less innocent and more adult-like than white girls of the same age. And I would want to stress that this isn't about what the girl might have experienced, how the girl might present herself. We engaged in research under the leadership of Dr. Jamelia Blake, who's a professor at Texas A&M University and wanted to pursue this, that isolated adults' perceptions free of context. So she developed a measurement tool that didn't include names, photographs, any individualizing context, and just asked the very bald question, do you think Black girls need to be protected? And the same questions for white girls, that we're measuring the perception of innocence of those girls. And she separated the surveys into age groups. And we hypothesized that the answers would start to diverge in terms of how adults perceived white and Black girls around the high school age, puberty, adolescence, and we were wrong. What we found was much more profound than that. And when you look at the differences between how adults respond to white girls and Black girls, they were taking these questions that say, do you believe girls need comforting and nurturing? And if it was a Black girl, they were rating that as less important than for a white girl. And the greatest discrepancy was in the age group of 10 to 14 years old. So
Wow.
middle school years, when is just the time that pre-adolescents are finding their place in the world, figuring out what the world expects of them, and what they can expect of others. And the second biggest age group discrepancy was in the age group of 5 to 9 years old. So that means this survey was given to an adult and said, do you think Black girls age 5 to 9 years old need nurturing? And the answer was less than 5, whereas a white girl would be rated higher. So we're talking about potentially a kindergartner being treated by police or by the teacher in her classroom as being less needy of the kinds of protections that we instinctively and as a culture consensually agree need to be treated like children, like innocent children. So the implications of this are really enormous. And we think that they are grounded in the kinds of stereotypes that have been around since very beginnings of our country, and beyond, where Black women and girls were seen as stereotypes that are so well known that they're referred to by their own nicknames, like the Sapphire and the Jezebel, indicating the dehumanization of Black women and girls being viewed as angry and promiscuous, and somehow superhumanly strong, such that when you project that stereotype onto girls, it translates into really not treating them as a human at all, but certainly not as a child, and certainly not girls who align, again, with that cultural consensus view of children as innocent people. And when you then layer that lens into the context of gender-based violence against Black girls, it goes against the way that we would treat a white girl who reported gender-based violence. Black girls, if they're seen in your mind's eye as an adult, might be viewed as consenting or complicit in the gender-based violence that they actually just survived. So there's going to be discrediting of the story. Studies have shown people don't think Black girls are as traumatized by sexual violence as white girls, right? So all of the mechanisms that are supposed to be in place to support children who have been victimized by gender-based violence fall away for Black girls who adults don't really see, apparently, according to our research, as particularly in need of protection, nurturing, and compassion.
That is so horrifying to me. And I can think about so many ways that it would affect really like it just increase the likelihood that a Black girl would enter the criminal legal system to begin with, but also obviously have a detrimental impact on the outcome and where that might head. We know that some states don't have like minimum age for arrest. So they can arrest a 6-year-old if they want to. And obviously that would probably, increase the likelihood that Black girls are disproportionately arrested over white girls. But in just thinking about that being a general social bias and how that would affect police officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys too. Defense attorneys, certainly we have our own issues
Absolutely.
and contribute to this problem. Um, juries, all kinds of different things. And it kind of, makes me think about the concept we talk about in a lot of different um, contexts with this issue, but the concept of the perfect victim. Like we view, we have this kind of stereotype of what a victim of gender-based violence or violence more generally might look like. And they're going to be, we tend to notice really in these kind of direct practice spaces too, and then research backs it when it's done, that we tend to look more favorably upon people that, don't have histories of mental health challenges, drug use, who have never been arrested before, who have never fought back against their abuser, all of these different things, and obviously race, sexual orientation, these things we might look more favorably towards certain types of people in a biased and unfair, obviously, way that leads to terrible outcomes for folks. And it's not to say that people who fit those quote perfect victim criteria have good outcomes in the criminal legal system. But this seems to kind of fit into that concept.
Yeah, and I would suggest there might be a parallel between the view of the perfect victim, who needs to be viewed as entirely innocent in the eyes of the person judging them, and children who are supposed to be completely innocent in the eyes of the person with authority over them. So I think there are similar issues in play. And racial bias really needs to be a part of the conversation, as well as gender bias when looking at discrediting reports of gender-based violence and punishing survivors of gender-based violence. And by the way, adultification bias is all too well known to Black women and girls. We did a follow-up study from our quantitative report to run focus groups with Black women and girls to ask them basically if our findings aligned with their life experiences. And to a person, they said, "You're not telling us anything we didn't already know." But that said, providing evidence and language to really name what's happening has really led to increased visibility of the problem. We've developed trainings on adultification bias for police, prosecutors, judges, and also doctors, others who have been shown to treat Black girls with this kind of bias that they're more like adults than the children that they really are. And it's one reason that Black girls and women don't go to police at all to report gender-based violence. They're not going to trust police. Their experience is replete with examples for why they shouldn't feel that anything good will happen as a result of going to police. So we have a situation with false reporting charges that we're currently studying, which, as I mentioned, occurs when someone goes to police, reports sexual assault or violence, the police don't believe them and arrest them instead for on the basis of charges of providing false information to police. That white girls are most often the stories that we hear, and that's only because white girls are the ones that think that police will do the right thing based on their experience, as opposed to Black culture experience with police that is the opposite.
It's really helpful context too in thinking about, we talk about mass incarceration, obviously, broadly, and we know that the rise of the criminalization of survivors tends to correlate with both the mass incarceration movement on the whole and also kind of the cultural idea of taking domestic violence more seriously that was adopted and pushed in the late 80s, early 90s, alongside the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. But when we talk about the mass incarceration movement, we tend to think about Black men, which is certainly not something to be, minimized. That gets, probably not as much attention and training as it should. But it's helpful to have some specific context around the way that this would affect Black females in the criminal legal system. So, kind of turning to, something else you kind of just mentioned in terms of false reporting and believing survivors generally. Can you talk about the concept of the credibility discount.
We know from studies, from anecdotal evidence, et cetera, that women and girls are routinely disbelieved when they report sexual assault, abuse, and trafficking, not only to law enforcement, but to people in their lives. And the whys of that are complicated, and experts have devoted incredible works devoted to this topic about the credibility discount, its existence, and where we are now. But in general, I would say it's a form of gender bias, a perpetuation of rape culture, and the acceptance of male supremacy and control over women and girls. And somewhat ironically, adolescents in particular receive the credibility discount. They are uniquely disbelieved in some ways because adolescent girls are stereotyped as criers, liars, and manipulators, which was the name of one study that looked at this in the context of juvenile justice facilities, and that caseworkers would report on the girls in their care as having lied, manipulated them into thinking things had happened that hadn't. And so, again, this goes to that challenge of adults perceiving girls as bad girls, especially so for girls of color and for girls involved in sexual assault allegations. So, when survivors are disbelieved, they're punished rather than being treated as survivors. And in addition to the harm this does to the individuals themselves, which is pretty obvious, it also perpetuates rape culture, and that needs to be named. And it allows abusers and traffickers to not be held accountable for the harm that they've committed and to not do better in ways that programs and support can offer to them to do.
It's, I think something that's really interesting about kind of what you just talked about generally, and also in thinking about how this would disproportionately affect Black girls, is the concept of like, especially this seems to me like it would be extra problematic in situations where people are coerced into criminal activity, because it's like this double layered, like, I have to believe that you were abused at all, which people aren't likely to believe. And then, even if you were abused, is that really quote unquote enough to justify, the tie between the abuse? Like, do we buy that you were abused? Do we buy that that is really why you stole, or really why you were engaging in prostitution, or quote unquote prostitution, being trafficked? But this concept of, if we already view these girls as bad girls, so to speak, then they stole from the convenience store because they were told to, or they helped deal drugs because they were told to, and were acting under duress. We're really not going to believe them, because we have to believe a lot of things that are favorable to them. Do you tend to get that sense too?
Absolutely. And one of the visualizations we've created is a three-circle Venn diagram of age bias, really youth bias, gender bias, and race bias. And Black girls are situated right at the overlapping point of all of those three forms of stereotypes and discriminations that can harm them, especially as survivors of gender-based violence.
Mm. And we know too, I think, like, it's so important that this concept affects survivors in all situations. So, obviously, in the sense of criminalization, which we know kind of the scrutiny's heightened, because people are like, oh, well, you're claiming this because it's a good excuse, so to speak, for what you did, the concept of the abuse excuse. But we know this also affects people just when they're seeking help, right? When people are trying to call police for protection, like you noted. Or are, making a report to a school authority figure or their social worker, or if they're in some sort of program or group home or whatever it might be, um, or just to even, any trusted adult, or quote unquote trusted adult in their life. But that it just makes it impossible for people to get help to begin with, which, when these situations perpetuate, that obviously increases the likelihood of criminalization, with criminalization being one of many terrible outcomes and endpoints for situations involving abuse.
Yeah. And another outcome, of course, is mental health outcomes that, were reflected in the CDC's recently released data about the mental health crisis that adolescent girls are going through right now. And I am not a mental health professional, but I have read studies that talk about how the experience of sexual assault and abuse to girls represents something they need to blame themselves for, they need to feel ashamed about. And that feeling of self blame and shame can easily lead toward PTSD, anxiety, depression, etc. And one interesting unintended result of a study that we conducted on restorative justice circles in school. So, not restorative justice to repair harm, but to build community. So, it's sort of an affirmative use of restorative justice, for lack of a better phrase, is that especially in contexts where it was single sex circles, so it was all students who identified as girls, the issue of sexual violence and sex trafficking came up time and again. And they reported that because of that sense of community, they felt supported, they felt less alone, and they felt like they learned that it is a more common experience. It's not something to blame themselves for. And when we were conducting these focus groups, it was striking that even though we never asked about the experience of sexual violence and how it works in restorative justice practices in school, multiple girls told us that they were experiencing suicidal ideations that got resolved by this sense of community with other girls and learning that no, it wasn't your fault. So when we don't believe survivors of gender-based violence, you're absolutely right to bring up all of these other consequences for the victim that we really need to be addressing in more creative and supportive ways as soon as it happens, ideally preventatively, of course, but as soon as it happens so that girls and women don't head down that path of those feelings of despair because it was their fault and something to be ashamed of.
And it makes me think too, in what you're describing, that, access to things like support groups or counseling or mental health services, or even medical treatment, if they were having a medical consequence of abuse or assault, would be a layered challenge for youth survivors, because obviously adult survivors, that's not easy to access. But for a lot of young people, you have to, whether it's, a finance issue, obviously, again, a challenge for adults too, but extra challenging for youth typically, or by way of the fact that if you're going to receive services, you have to have permission of a parent or guardian, which would require disclosure and then the support of that person to sign the form or transportation, take them to the appointment or whatever it might be. So, this culture of not believing survivors. I think I gratefully grew up with a mom and dad that would have believed me and supported me had I told them that. But that's not always the case for people, even with their caregivers or closest adults in their life.
And we should layer on to that the experience of immigrants, and especially in this context, how dangerous it can be to go to seek help in whatever context. The threat is present now more than ever that the consequence of that can be disastrous for the girl herself or her family.
A super important point. Thank you for noting that. So, in thinking about all of these awful challenges that are faced around our communities and across the country, we do know that there are some places and people that there have been attempts, whether fruitful and effective, or not, and to varying degrees. But there have been some, attempts at making law and policy that addresses these challenges in the system. So I know you've been working on a project kind of collecting data across the country about what states are doing. So can you tell us about the survey you're planning to release on laws across the country, what that's looking like, what kind of laws you're documenting, what you're finding in that work?
Right now, it's so important to find places for hope in this work. And one place that I find great rays of hope is in the States and the work that people like you are doing to make progress. So we're pivoting to really drill down on efforts by states to help with the issue of criminalized survivors. And there's some incredible innovative work that's being done. And we are releasing a 50 state survey so that attorneys and others can find the protective legislation that's available in their state for that can help fight the criminalization of gender-based survivors. And the four categories that we're really looking at are vacatur and expungement, which again can be especially important for immigrants in preserving their lack of criminal record, but for everybody to get a job and to survive in the way that they should be able to without the taint of a criminal record. We're looking at safe harbor laws that prohibit the prosecution or arrest of sex trafficking survivors, especially people under the age of 18. And then we're looking at affirmative defenses. So we're looking at self-defense, which is typically defined in a way that excludes the kind of pattern of coercion rather than, like we were talking about before, the situation where a person is pointing a gun at their head, so that we can reform those laws and laws of defining self-defense as well, so that courts need to consider the context in which the survivor's actions took place, whether to mitigate their sentence or to provide an affirmative defense so that we don't get the sentences to begin with.
Super helpful. And I think it's, super important, especially now, as you pointed out, in terms of our kind of the context and climate we're living in, to provide good access to information, because that's become certainly a challenge recently. And as we noted earlier, this field in particular tends to have kind of a gap in data collection. And I know some people like your organization and the National Center for the Defense of Criminalized Survivors at the Battered Women's Justice Project. They're really great at collecting and putting out helpful information. So that, is certainly a super important role and is so helpful to people like me who are on the ground doing direct practice, and then other advocates and lawmakers and policy folks. And I think to your point, in the work that we're doing, we're hoping to certainly mitigate sentences in the way that you described, and also allow people who are already in prison to petition for their sentence to be mitigated, which is something, a great tool that Oklahoma has implemented, New York, Illinois, some other states are headed in that direction as well.
Yes.
But also, like you noted, to prevent those convictions to begin with through comprehensive affirmative defenses. In the survey you've done so far, have you come across any like laws or kind of, specific laws or ways that different types of laws are structured, or particular features of them that you find to be particularly effective, or just general things to consider that you think are important for folks who are thinking about what can I do or to change the law, or what should the law look like to better protect criminalized survivors?
There's a few ways to really make sure that a bill is as strong as we can make it to really provide comprehensive protection to criminalized survivors. And one of those is defining gender-based violence broadly enough so that it includes sex trafficking survivors, dating violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, not necessarily within a household, but in any realm of the survivor's life. Some of the innovative pieces that we've seen are laws that recognize the effect of adverse childhood experiences, not necessarily the experience of current gender-based violence, but the effect that experiencing trauma in childhood can have on the actions of adults. And I've been encouraged to see a couple examples of states that list adverse childhood experiences, not even limited to sexual violence as a child, as a factor to consider in mitigating a person's sentence. Another piece that feels very important is to make a law mandatory for the court to consider and give weight to, as opposed to permissible. The reason for that is clear, and that is partly due to gender bias in the court system and by attorneys who are presenting these cases in terms of recognizing the importance of this. So we need to make it mandatory, and we need to expand the evidence that is allowed to prove the context of gender-based violence.
And to your point, and kind of compiling those 2 points and bias and evidence, we know that there tends to be this kind of thought in the world that if you really had survived gender-based violence, you would have sought help from what we recognize as kind of credible providers of help, like law enforcement or healthcare professionals or social service providers working in structured programs or whatever it might be. But we know that for a lot of reasons, like you described, whether it's experience based on race, immigration status, maybe sexual orientation or gender identity, and your kind of perception of how these people are going to respond to you, or based on previous experience, people don't always reach out for help at all, but especially to those particular kind of official help providing agencies, and they might more so reach out to friends and family members, or they might not have a lot of friends and family members to reach out to because abusers tend to isolate the people that they abuse. So we definitely, we totally agree and have tried to work on that in our work and making it clear that there are a lot of different forms of evidence that should be considered as relevant and kind of moving the needle on showing that this happened. And also in
Yeah.
trying to, we've tried to think about creating some kind of pathways for discretion, where especially in these older cases where we still have substantial challenges with survivors being believed, but especially in if you were resentencing somebody who was convicted 30 years ago, it's even less likely that they would have been believed or that it would have been well documented if they even reached out for help. And so we tried to kind of create some pathways for if
Mm.
we're kind of all on the same page, the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and the judge, that we really think this is what happened, but there's not quite enough there to meet the evidentiary standard. If we all agree, the law still allows the judge to make that decision, to go ahead and give that person relief, because we think that that really accounts for the dynamics of domestic violence, that creating some really specific evidentiary threshold without any sort of carve out is going to exclude people, even if we are all on the same page that we really think that happened, but we can't quite meet the threshold because of the dynamics of domestic violence and how it ends up being witnessed or documented, or really not witnessed and not documented.
Right. So there needs to be very careful cross-referencing and pursuing this reform, like we were talking about before, to make sure that it applies to children in the juvenile justice system, to make sure that the rules of evidence are allowing the proof that is required by the newly reformed laws. And you're really right to your point that our understanding has evolved so much about the dynamics of abusive relationships, et cetera. And yet there's so much work to do to get law, policy, and the courts to catch up. And why is that? I think you're right that sometimes people are all on the same page, but various things happen. And we're not making as much progress as we can because of the vicissitudes of the legal system. But I have to say, gender bias and the perpetuation of controlling women is also a really big part of that. And it's so hard to get at. And that's why I would always fight for mandatory presumptions rather than a court's discretion to give weight to certain pieces of evidence than not. It's that I think training and education and informing is important, but as you said, it's not everything. Sometimes we really need to drag the courts kicking and screaming into the 21st century.
And to your point too, like in that topic, it's important that, I think we have this flaw in the system in a lot of areas. I had a really interesting internship when I was in my first year of law school. I worked for DV Leap, which is now oh, they just changed their name again. I think it's Volare in
Oh,
DC.
yes, Valari, yes,
Yes.
yes.
And they do appellate work in family violence cases across the country, more in the civil space, so like divorces and temporary protective orders. Fabulous lawyers there, founded by the amazing Joan Meyer. And we got to look at, I got to look at kind of how different courts across the country handle these things. And in looking at, in like child custody disputes, for example, most states use the best interest of the child standard to determine who gets custody, which tends to be a balancing of factors test. But it was really interesting to see how in some states the judge really could just say, I considered the factors and here's what I decided, which is so notably different than the judge has to walk through the factors in their
Exactly.
order and explain what they considered, the weight that they gave it, because really then in the appellate courts it's so hard to win when you're challenging abuse of discretion, because we tend to give a lot of deference to judges' discretion when there is not something like what you described, some sort of binding. If you meet the standard, you have to resent it. If the person meets the standard, you have to resentence them. Or not just, we know in our state, domestic violence is a mitigating factor at sentencing, but people are strung by mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And B, even when they can, they're supposed to mitigate the sentence based on domestic violence. To your point, it's sometimes just not happening. So we see, at least in what we're doing, that this kind of gives as one of my colleagues put it, domestic violence is a mitigating factor, and we are kind of giving and now what? Like, it is mitigating, so here's what you have to do when it's there. Um, so that's super
Mm.
agree, super important. Um, would love to hear from you to kind of close us out, what's next for you in this work, where you think you're headed, where the center is headed, and anything else you think is important to share with us.
Well, I'm excited to be engaged in a study of false reporting that is being led by one of our senior scholars who's a professor at LSU Law, Lisa Avalos. And she is interviewing women who were criminalized as a result of their reporting sexual abuse. We're in the process of gathering data on that now and hoping to come out with a report on that by the end of the year, which I think will provide much needed public awareness of this problem, which I'm old enough now that many of my law school colleagues and I are sort of seasoned professionals. Some of them are veteran prosecutors and they have never heard of this and they find it hard to believe. Um, so this will provide some much needed evidence that that's happening. And as I mentioned before, happily turning to states like Georgia and Oklahoma, who are doing such good work and working with you all to document what you're doing and compiling some data and evidence of how well these laws are working to help people who deserve not to be incarcerated.
That is so wonderful. We're so thankful for the work that you're doing. It's a really helpful, the data is so helpful also in, compelling change makers and lawmakers that this change is needed to begin with. So I think that's super helpful. And I think the work that you're doing in particular states is helpful for other states to get it off the ground, for folks to see that Oklahoma did it, that we're trying to do it and hopefully succeed in doing it. And then other states across the country are doing this work. Hopefully, having someone in your position to kind of centralize that information and distribute it effectively, hopefully will help kind of create momentum that keeps this going and lets other people get this done and help these folks. So we're super appreciative of your time and sharing all of your awesome expertise with us. And we are looking forward to continuing to work with you in the future and are super grateful for all you've done for us.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and congratulations on the progress that you all are making in Georgia.
Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Until They're Free. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Rebecca and learned as much from her as we certainly did. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll continue to follow along. We have some exciting, moving, and inspiring content in store for all of you. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on Until They're Free.